When the external clamor of the world recedes, it often leaves a hollow space where a different kind of noise begins to gather. A private courtroom that requires no judge and no jury, because the accused is also the prosecutor. In the stillness that follows the day, the mind tends to turn inward to perform its most relentless work, sifting through the wreckage of hours past and finding fault in the smallness of human effort. It is a peculiar habit of the spirit to mistake these rapid judgmental currents for the truth of one's existence, as if the storm of a passing thought were the permanent climate of the soul. There is a profound difference between the weather of the mind and the sky that holds it. The clouds may gather in dark, heavy masses of regret and self-reproach, yet they are merely phenomena passing through a vastness that remains untouched by their movement. The voice that speaks of failure and unworthiness is often nothing more than a conditioned echo, a collection of old habits that have mistaken their own volume for authority. It is easy to view the self as a solid, unchanging entity that must be perfected or punished, yet the wisdom of the ages suggests that the I, which feels so heavy with guilt, is itself a shifting mosaic of changing states, arising and dissolving in a constant, restless flux. There is no fixed, permanent core to be condemned, only a sequence of moments, each one beginning and ending before the next can even take hold. To stand in judgment of a self that is never the same from one moment to the next is to attempt to grasp the wind or to anchor a river. It is a labor that yields only exhaustion. True character is not found in the achievement of an impossible, polished perfection, but in the simple, honest stewardship of one's own nature amidst the inevitable stumbling of being human. We are all part of a shared, fragile condition, bound by the same limitations and the same tendency to falter, making the harshness of self-judgment a strange and unnecessary cruelty directed at a fellow traveler. When the long war against the self is finally set aside, it is not because the flaws have vanished, but because the need to fight them has been recognized as a misunderstanding of what we truly are. In that recognition, a quietude emerges that does not require the world to change, but merely requires the recognition that the observer of the storm is not the storm itself. The weight of the world often feels as though it rests entirely upon the individual, a crushing sense of responsibility for things that are, by their very nature, beyond the reach of human agency. It is a common tragedy of the modern condition to mistake the sphere of one's influence for the entirety of existence, attempting to bend the currents of fate and the opinions of others to the will of a single, lonely ego. This struggle creates a profound tension, a constant straining against the grain of reality that leaves the spirit frayed and the mind perpetually on guard. There is a certain dignity in the recognition that much of what we fear is merely the shadow cast by our own expectations, a distortion created when we demand that life conform to a script of our own writing. When the boundary between what can be controlled and what must be accepted is blurred, the result is a pervasive sense of anxiety, a feeling that one is always running late for a destination that does not exist. It is helpful to consider the nature of time not as a line of constant progress or a sequence of missed opportunities, but as a series of arrivals that are gone the moment they are perceived. The past is a ghost that has no substance in the present, a memory of a version of oneself that has already dissolved into the stream of impermanence. to carry the weight of what has already transpired is to attempt to walk through a landscape while dragging the heavy stones of every step already taken. It offers no movement, only a burden that makes the current step more difficult to navigate. The mind has a remarkable capacity for creating suffering through the mere act of anticipation, or the relentless replaying of a scene, spinning a web of what if that captures the spirit in a state of perpetual readiness for a catastrophe that may never arrive. This readiness is a form of tension that the body and mind interpret as a signal of actual danger, even when the only threat is the thought of a threat itself. There is a deep, quiet truth in the observation that much of our suffering arises not from what happens to us, but from the stories we tell ourselves about what happens to us. We take a simple event, a moment of silence, or a minor setback, and we weave around it a tapestry of meaning that is dense with judgment and sorrow. This weaving is the work of the ego, which seeks to maintain its own sense of importance by making every event a personal affront or a cosmic sign of failure. If one could look at life with the same impartiality that a mountain looks upon the passing clouds, the sense of personal injury would begin to lose its grip. The mountain does not seek to influence the wind, nor does it judge the rain for its sudden arrival. It simply exists as the vessel through which these movements pass. To exist in this way is not to become indifferent or cold, but to find a center that is not easily moved by the fluctuations of circumstance. This center is not a place one travels to, but a realization of what has always been there, beneath the layers of reaction and preference. Loneliness, too, is often a symptom of this perceived separation. The sensation that one is an island, adrift in an infinite and indifferent sea. We spend much of our lives building walls to protect ourselves from the vulnerability of being seen, yet these same walls create the very isolation we dread. We mistake the social mask, the role we play in our work, our families, and our communities, for the totality of our being, and when that mask fails to meet the expectations of others, we feel a profound sense of emptiness. This emptiness is not a void to be filled with more achievements, more possessions, or more validation, but a space that has been misunderstood as a deficiency. It is in the recognition of this shared emptiness that true connection begins to emerge, for we are all, in some sense, navigating the same darkness, seeking the same warmth, and fearing the same dissolution. To be alone is a biological fact, but to be lonely is a psychological interpretation of that fact, a refusal to recognize the underlying unity that exists in the shared experience of being alive. Even in the most profound solitude, there is a connection to the rhythm of the universe, a participation in the great, unceasing dance of birth, growth, decay, and renewal. There is a strange comfort in the realization that everything is in a state of flux, that even the most enduring structures of our lives are subject to the law of change. This impermanence is not a cause for despair, though it often feels so to the uninitiated. Rather, it is the very condition that makes life possible. If things were static, there could be no growth, no learning, and no movement. If the moment were permanent, there could be no beauty in the fleetingness of a sunset or the delicate fragility of a flower. The beauty of the world lies precisely in its refusal to stay, in its constant, shimmering departure. To accept this is to stop trying to hold on to the water in our hands and to instead learn how to swim in the current. This does not mean a retreat from life, but a deeper engagement with it, a willingness to participate fully in the unfolding of experience without the desperate need to possess or to preserve. The shadows of the self, those parts of our nature we find most difficult to acknowledge. The anger, the jealousy, the greed, the hidden selfishness are not intruders to be banished, but integral parts of the whole human landscape. We often spend a vast amount of energy attempting to suppress these qualities, creating a psychic split that requires immense effort to maintain. This internal war is the source of much of our exhaustion. We are constantly policing our own thoughts, trying to curate a version of ourselves that is palatable and good. Yet, the light cannot exist without the shadow, and any attempt to deny the darkness only serves to give it more power in the subconscious. The goal of a contemplative life is not to become a person without shadow, but to become a person who is whole enough to acknowledge the darkness without being consumed by it. When we stop fighting our own nature, we find that the energy previously spent on suppression can be redirected toward understanding and compassion. This compassion begins with the self, not as a form of indulgence, but as a form of radical honesty. It is the ability to look at one's own flaws with the same steady, non-judgmental gaze that one might cast upon a tree that has grown crooked or a stone that is weathered by the sea. There is no shame in the crookedness of a tree. It is simply the result of the conditions in which it has grown. Similarly, our flaws are the results of our history, our wounds, and our attempts to find safety in a world that often feels unsafe. When we view ourselves through this lens of causality rather than through the lens of moral judgment, the heavy burden of shame begins to lift. We realize that we are not bad or good. In an ultimate sense, we are simply complex beings responding to a complex world. This realization allows for a more stable sense of peace, a peace that is not dependent on being perfect, but on being aware. Awareness is the steady light that illuminates the room, revealing the objects within it without needing to change their shape. It is the ability to witness the movement of the mind, the racing thoughts, the sudden bursts of emotion, the heavy waves of sadness, as mere events occurring within a wider field of consciousness. You are not the thought that says, "I am not enough." You are the presence that hears the thought. You are not the emotion that says, "I am afraid." You are the vastness in which the fear arises and eventually subsides. In the quietude of this realization, the need for certainty begins to fade. We spend so much of our lives seeking a foundation that will never move, a guarantee of safety or a final answer to the mysteries of existence. We want to know that we are on the right path, that our lives have a definitive meaning, and that the future will be kind. But the nature of life is not to provide certainty, but to provide experience. The attempt to find certainty is a flight from the reality of being, a way of trying to freeze the world so that we might feel in control. When we surrender the demand for certainty, we find ourselves standing on the edge of a profound openness. This is not a state of emptiness, but a state of profound receptivity, where we are finally able to meet life as it is, rather than as we wish it to be. This acceptance is not a passive resignation to fate, but an active alignment with the truth of the present moment. It is the courage to be present in the midst of uncertainty, to walk through the fog without the need for a map, trusting in the capacity of the self to meet whatever arises. The tension of life often comes from the gap between our desire for things to be different and the reality of things as they are. Closing that gap is the essence of wisdom. It does not require a change in the external world, but a change in the internal relationship to the world. When we stop resisting the flow of existence, we find that we are carried by it rather than struggling against it. This is the quiet strength of the Stoic, who knows that while we cannot control the wind, we can adjust our sails. It is the grace of the Buddhist, who understands that the self is a process and that attachment to a permanent I is the root of all sorrow. In the end, the wisdom of the ages points toward a singular, simple truth, that the peace we seek is not something to be attained through effort, but something to be uncovered by letting go of the illusions that obscure it. It is the quiet realization that the seeker and the sought are one, and that the stillness we long for has been the very ground upon which we have been walking all along. There is a particular kind of silence that arrives when the world finally recedes, a stillness that does not always bring peace, but instead opens a door to a private courtroom where the trial never ends. In this hollow space, a voice arises that is familiar and unrelenting, a prosecutor that knows every secret shame and every half-finished intention, weaving a tapestry of perceived failures that feels more real than the air itself. This voice, this internal critic, operates with a relentless certainty, presenting a list of grievances against a version of the self that is perpetually found wanting, as if there were a fixed and permanent entity that could be held perpetually accountable for every stumble and every shadow. It is a heavy burden to carry. This sense of being a defendant in one's own mind, where the verdict is always a condemnation and the evidence is drawn from the darkest corners of memory. It is easy to mistake this voice for the truth of who one is, to believe that the harshness of the judgment is a reflection of an objective reality, rather than a conditioned habit of mind, a storm of thought that arises and passes like the clouds across an expansive sky. This judge is not a master, but a byproduct of a mind trained in the art of survival, a mechanism that believes that by being merciless toward the self, it can somehow prevent future errors, as if cruelty could ever be the soil from which true wisdom grows. This belief is a profound misunderstanding of the nature of the mind, for the critic is merely a pattern of thought, a repetitive mental weather that gains strength through the very resistance it meets, growing more formidable the more one attempts to fight it or flee from it. In the deep wisdom of the Buddha, one finds a different way to view this internal turmoil. For there is no solid, unchanging, or permanent self to be judged, only a continuous stream of arising and passing sensations, thoughts, and perceptions. When the mind looks closely at the one who feels guilty or the one who feels inadequate, it finds only a shifting landscape of momentary states, none of which possess the permanence required to be truly guilty or truly flawed. The sense of a guilty self is a conceptual construction, a knot tied in the flowing river of consciousness, and when one observes the mechanics of how this knot is tied, the tension begins to lose its grip on the spirit. The shame that feels so solid and heavy is, in reality, a collection of fleeting mental events, none of which have the authority to define the vast and luminous emptiness from which they emerge. There is a profound difference between the weight of a mistake and the weight of a self-judgment. that claims the mistake is the essence of one's being. To see the critic as a passing phenomenon is to recognize that the storm of self-reproach is not the sky itself, but merely a turbulent weather system passing through the vastness of awareness. The sky remains untouched by the thunder, just as the underlying consciousness remains unblemished by the accusations that rise and fall within it. This realization does not negate the reality of human error, nor does it dismiss the sting of regret, but it strips the critic of its power to define the totality of a human life, leaving only the specific moment of experience without the crushing addition of a permanent, flawed identity. The Stoics offer a different, yet complementary perspective on this internal struggle, reminding us that we are the guardians of our own character, responsible only for the integrity of our will and the honesty of our efforts in this present moment. The pursuit of perfection is a phantom, a standard of flawlessness that no human being has ever reached, and no human being can ever sustain. For to be human is to be inherently limited, finite, and prone to error. To hold oneself to a standard of divine perfection is a form of arrogance that denies the shared human condition. For every person walks a path marked by stumbling, by misunderstanding, and by the inevitable limitations of their own perspective. The Stoic finds peace not in the achievement of perfection, but in the alignment of one's will with the truth of what is, accepting that while we are responsible for our intentions, we are not masters of the outcomes or the chaotic whims of the world. When we view our struggles through this lens, the harshness of the inner critic begins to seem not only unnecessary, but fundamentally irrational. If we would extend profound gentleness and patience to a friend who is suffering, or to a stranger who has made a mistake, why is it that we deny that same grace to the very vessel of our own existence? This refusal to offer self-compassion is a strange form of asceticism, a belief that suffering is a prerequisite for growth, when in truth, it is often the very hardness of our own judgment that prevents the softness required for genuine transformation. The spirit cannot flourish in an environment of constant condemnation. It requires the nourishment of acceptance to find the strength to rise after a fall. This acceptance is not a passive resignation to failure, nor is it an excuse for negligence, but a profound recognition of the reality of the human situation. It is the understanding that we are often operating from a place of fatigue, fear, or confusion, and that the impulse to judge ourselves is often a misguided attempt to protect ourselves from the pain of being seen as imperfect. To set down the war against the self is to recognize that the enemy we have been fighting is an illusion, a ghost conjured by the mind to make sense of its own complexity. The battlefield is a hall of mirrors, where every strike against the self only serves to deepen the scars, and the only way to win the war is to realize that there is no one to fight. There is a quietness that becomes possible when the long, exhausting siege of self-judgment is finally abandoned, a stillness that is not the absence of thought, but the absence of the struggle against thought. It is a state of being where one can look at a failure or a shortcoming without the immediate, reflexive sting of shame, observing it instead as a piece of data, a moment in time, a part of the unfolding dance of experience. In this space, the energy that was once spent on the relentless prosecution of the self is returned to the present moment, available to be used for living, for noticing, and for being. The burden of being a wrongdoer is replaced by the lightness of being a learner, someone who is perpetually in the process of becoming without the requirement of having ever arrived. This shift in perspective is perhaps the most profound transition a person can undergo, for it moves the center of gravity from the ego's demands to the heart's capacity for presence. It is the realization that the person who judges is just as much a part of the unfolding process as the person being judged, and that both are subject to the laws of impermanence and change. When the internal courtroom is emptied, the soul finds room to breathe, no longer constricted by the walls of a private prison built from the bricks of past regrets. The silence that remains is not empty, but full of the capacity to witness the world as it is, without the distorting lens of self-criticism, and full of the possibility of a life lived with a quiet, steady, and unshakable dignity. In the end, the goal is not to become a person who never makes mistakes, but to become a person who is no longer destroyed by them, someone who can hold their own imperfections with the same steady, compassionate gaze they would offer to the rest of the world. This is the intersection of the Stoic's resilience and the Buddha's compassion, a way of being that is both grounded in the reality of our limitations and elevated by the recognition of our shared humanity. It is a way of living that honors the struggle without being consumed by it, finding in the very midst of life's chaos a center of gravity that is unshakable because it is no longer tied to the shifting sands of self-image. The war is over, not because the battles have ceased, but because the soldier has finally realized that there was never anything to fight but the shadow of his own making. The landscape of the mind is not a fixed territory, but a series of overlapping rhythms, much like the tide that pulls at the shore, retreating only to return with a different weight and a different purpose. We often spend our lives trying to build dams against these tides, attempting to freeze the water into a permanent, predictable structure that we can control and inhabit with certainty. This desire for permanence is the root of much of our suffering, for to demand that the mind be still is to demand that the ocean cease its movement, and in that impossible demand we find ourselves drowning in the very waves we sought to tame. The Stoic recognizes that the movement of the world, including the movement of our own thoughts and emotions, is part of a larger, rational order that is beyond our command, and that true freedom is found in the quality of our response to this movement, rather than in the attempt to halt it. When we stop trying to command the waves and instead learn to observe their rise and fall, the turbulence of anxiety begins to lose its character as an existential threat and becomes instead a natural phenomenon, a passing agitation in the vast ocean of awareness. This observation is not a detachment that leads to coldness or indifference, but a profound form of engagement that allows us to see things as they truly are, without the distorting veil of our own projections and fears. We are often so caught up in the story. We tell ourselves about what a moment means, whether it is a moment of triumph, a moment of failure, or a moment of profound loneliness, that we miss the actual quality of the moment itself, which is always simply this: a current of experience flowing through the aperture of consciousness. The labels we attach to our experiences are the heavy garments we wear, often becoming so heavy that we forget we are the one wearing them, and begin to believe we are the garments themselves. We mistake the labels of anxious person or unsuccessful person for the core of our being, failing to see that these are merely descriptions of temporary states, as transient as the clouds that drift across a summer sky. If we can see the thought of inadequacy as a transient event, a mental weather pattern that has arisen due to certain conditions and will eventually dissipate when those conditions change, we reclaim the space required for true presence. This realization is the beginning of a deeper kind of courage, the courage to stand in the midst of life's inevitable uncertainty without the desperate need to grasp for a certainty that does not exist. It is the courage to be imperfect, to be unfinished, and to be perpetually in flux, recognizing that the very nature of existence is a constant process of becoming and passing away. The loneliness that haunts the heart is often a symptom of this resistance to change, a mourning for a version of ourselves or a version of the world that we wish would remain static, a refusal to accept the fundamental truth that all things are interconnected and in a state of constant movement. When we accept the impermanence of the self, we also accept the impermanence of our isolation. For the boundaries we draw between ourselves and the rest of existence are also conceptual constructions, thin veils that dissolve when we stop clinging to the idea of a separate, isolated ego. In the quietude that follows this acceptance, there is a sense of belonging that does not require the validation of others or the achievement of specific milestones, but is found simply in the fact of our being, a belonging that is inherent in the very fabric of the cosmos. The weight of the past, which often feels like a crushing debt we must eternally repay, begins to lose its gravity when we see it, not as a fixed record of who we are, but as a series of completed movements in an ongoing dance. We cannot change the notes that have already been played, but we are not required to remain trapped in the melody of a song that has already finished. We are here now, in the current measure, with the capacity to respond to the notes as they arise. This is the essence of the wisdom that seeks to live in accordance with nature, accepting the unfolding of life with a steady hand and an open heart, even when the unfolding is painful or unexpected. It is the recognition that the shadows are part of the wholeness, that the darkness is not an intrusion upon the light, but a necessary part of the depth and complexity of the human experience. To attempt to excise the shadow is to attempt to create a shallow, one-dimensional existence, for it is through the integration of our light and our darkness, our joy and our sorrow, that we achieve a sense of wholeness that is resilient and true. This integration does not require us to be happy all the time, which is a modern fallacy that only serves to deepen our alienation from the reality of human suffering, but rather to be present for all that arises, with a sense of dignity and a quiet, unwavering compassion. This compassion must extend first to the parts of ourselves that we find most difficult to face. The parts that are fearful, the parts that are angry, the parts that are profoundly lost. For to reject any part of our own experience is to live a fractured and divided life. When we offer compassion to our own struggle, we are not condoning error, but we are acknowledging the human condition that makes error so inevitable, creating a space where we can learn from our mistakes rather than being destroyed by them. In this space, the pursuit of wisdom becomes a gentle unfolding rather than a strenuous climb, a process of uncovering the truth that was always there, beneath the layers of conditioning, judgment, and fear. We find that the peace we have been searching for in the external world, in the achievement of goals or the seeking of approval, was actually the stillness that resides in the center of the storm, waiting to be recognized when the struggle against life finally ceases. This stillness is not a state of emptiness, but a state of profound fullness, a capacity to hold the entirety of life, its beauty and its terror, its joy and its grief, without being swept away by any single part of it. It is the quiet realization that we are not the victims of our thoughts, but the space in which thoughts occur, and that the vastness of that space is far greater than any thought that could ever arise within it. There is a persistent, relentless courtroom that operates in the silence, a private tribunal where the verdict is always predetermined, and the prosecutor is a voice that sounds remarkably like our own. This voice arrives most unbidden when the external clamor of the world begins to recede, carving out a hollow space where the echoes of past mistakes and perceived inadequacies rise to meet the stillness. It is a specialized form of suffering, a way of being that seeks to litigate the past and preemptively condemn the future, turning the mind into a landscape of constant, jagged judgment. We carry this inner accuser as if it were a fundamental truth of our character, a permanent record of our failings that defines the very core of our being. Yet this voice is nothing more than a conditioned habit of thought, a repetitive pattern of mental weather that has been mistaken for the sky itself. Just as a thunderstorm may roll across a vast expanse of air, leaving behind clouds and rain, the critical voice arrives with its thunderous certainties and its lightning-strike accusations, only to pass, leaving the underlying vastness of awareness unchanged and untouched. The weight of this self-judgment often stems from the illusion of a solid, unchanging, and permanent self that can be held responsible for every tremor of error. In the deep wisdom of the Buddha, we find the insight that there is no fixed, singular entity sitting in the prisoner's dock, but rather a continuous, flowing stream of changing states, sensations, and perceptions that arise and fall away in a ceaseless dance of impermanence. When we look closely at the I that we condemn, we find only a collection of shifting processes, thoughts that arise, feelings that pass, memories that flicker, none of which possess the substance to be eternally guilty. The person who made a mistake 5 years ago is not the same person who is thinking the thought of that mistake today. The person who is suffering now is a different configuration of elements than the one who was once triumphant. To condemn the self is to attempt to imprison a river, to try and nail a shadow to the ground, to demand that the wind remain still so that it might be judged for its direction. This misunderstanding of the self leads to a profound loneliness, a sense that we are fundamentally flawed beings navigating a world that demands a perfection we were never meant to sustain. We often hold ourselves to a standard of flawless execution and moral purity that we would never dream of imposing upon another living soul, forgetting that the same gentleness and grace we so readily offer to a struggling friend is a debt we owe to our own humanity. There is a certain irony in our capacity for empathy toward the external world and our simultaneous cruelty toward the internal one, as if we believe that by being harsh with ourselves, we might somehow refine our character or force ourselves toward virtue. Yet, the Stoic perspective suggests that virtue is not a product of self-flagellation, but a result of living in accordance with our true nature, which is to act with reason and social connection. The Stoic understands that while we are responsible for the integrity of our intentions and the honesty of our efforts, we are not the masters of outcomes, nor are we the architects of the inherent limitations of our human nature. We are part of a vast, interconnected web of existence, and to stumble is not a failure of the soul, but a natural consequence of being a finite creature navigating an infinite and unpredictable reality. The internal war is fought on a battlefield of our own making, where we demand that we be more than we are, and in doing so, we create the very tension we seek to resolve. We treat our flaws as if they were permanent stains on our essence, rather than temporary disturbances in the flow of experience. This constant striving for a version of ourselves that is beyond reproach, beyond error, and beyond vulnerability is a pursuit of a phantom. It is an attempt to achieve a state of being that is static and unmoving, which is fundamentally at odds with the very nature of life, which is movement, change, and constant flux. When we stop trying to achieve this impossible stability, we begin to see that the struggle is not against our shortcomings, but against the reality of change itself. The anxiety that arises from self-judgment is often just the friction caused by trying to hold on to a version of ourselves that has already vanished, or trying to prevent a version of ourselves that has yet to arrive. If one considers the nature of a mistake, one sees that it is merely a data point in the unfolding of a life, a moment of learning that is inseparable from the act of living. To judge a mistake as a moral catastrophe is to lose sight of its utility in the grander movement of growth. There is a profound dignity in the acceptance of our own fallibility, a recognition that to be human is to be beautifully, inevitably imperfect. This is not a descent into complacency or a dismissal of the importance of effort, but rather a shift in the foundation of that effort. When we act from a place of self-acceptance, our actions are no longer frantic attempts to prove our worth or to outrun our shame. Instead, they become an expression of our engagement with the world, driven by a desire to contribute and to connect, rather than a desperate need to be validated. The quiet that becomes possible when the long war against oneself finally ceases is not the quiet of a vacuum, but the quiet of a settled peace. It is the peace of a person who has stopped trying to litigate the wind and has instead chosen to sit quietly in the midst of the breeze. It is the realization that the voice of judgment, no matter how loud or how convincing, has no more authority over the truth of our being than the passing of a cloud has over the sun. This truth is found in the recognition that we are the witness of the thoughts, not the thoughts themselves. We are the awareness in which the judge and the accused both arise and eventually dissolve. In this awareness, there is no need for a verdict, for the witness does not judge the clouds for being gray or the wind for being cold. The witness simply holds them all in a vast, unconditioned presence. As we move through the complexities of existence, we find that the most significant transformation is not the changing of our circumstances, but the changing of our relationship to the internal landscape that experiences them. The shadows of our past, the anxieties of our future, and the judgments of our present moment are all part of the same shifting tapestry of experience. They are not enemies to be conquered, but phenomena to be understood, seen for what they are, ripples on the surface of a deep and tranquil ocean. When we stop trying to smooth the ripples, we begin to experience the depth of the ocean itself, which remains unmoved by the surface turbulence. This depth is our true nature, a spaciousness that is capable of encompassing all that arises without being diminished by any of it, a wholeness that is present even in the midst of our most profound disorientation. It is a slow, unhurried realization that we are allowed to be exactly as we are in this very moment, without the need for apology or the demand for improvement. This does not mean we cease to grow, for growth is a natural consequence of being alive, but it means that our growth is no longer fueled by the bitterness of self-loathing. We move from a state of constant correction to a state of constant presence, where the focus shifts from what we have failed to be to what we are currently experiencing. In this shift, the heavy burden of the self as a project to be managed is laid down, and we find ourselves standing on much firmer ground, the ground of reality as it is, rather than the reality we have constructed through the lens of our own criticism. There is a profound relief in acknowledging that the person we have been criticizing is a collection of habits, a series of mental movements that can be observed with compassion rather than condemnation. When the mind begins to weave its familiar patterns of self-blame, we can observe the weaving, note the textures of the threads, and see the movement of the shuttle, all without becoming lost in the fabric. This observation is not a way of distancing ourselves from our lives, but a way of engaging with them more deeply, with more clarity and less distortion. It is the difference between being caught in a whirlpool and being the water that flows through it, feeling the movement and the pressure, but remaining fundamentally part of the whole, moving toward the sea. In the end, the only true victory is the cessation of the struggle to be something other than what is occurring in this moment. The most radical act of courage is not the conquest of an external foe, but the quiet, steady acceptance of our own humanity, with all its beautiful, messy, and transient complexity. We are part of a vast, breathing cosmos that is itself in a state of constant becoming, a cosmic process of arising and passing that requires no justification and seeks no perfection. To align ourselves with this reality is to find a sense of belonging that cannot be granted or taken away by any thought, any judgment, or any mistake, for it is the very foundation of our existence, the silent, steady pulse of life that continues even when the courtroom is empty and the judge has finally gone home. The weight of the past is often a heavy, phantom burden, a collection of shadows cast by events that have long since ceased to exist in the physical realm. Yet, they continue to exert a gravitational pull upon the present. We carry these ghosts as if they were solid objects, as if the memory of a mistake or the sting of a former grief could be held and manipulated in the hands of the now. But the nature of time is such that the past is not a place we inhabit, but a series of mental constructs that arise and fall within the current moment. To hold on to the past is to attempt to grasp the smoke of a fire that has already burned out, a futile effort that only serves to cloud the clarity of the present. When we recognize the impermanence of all things, we see that the person who committed the error is not the same person who is currently observing the memory. The self is a river, not a monolith, and the water that flowed through the canyon yesterday is not the water that flows through it today. This fluidity is not a cause for instability, but a profound reason for hope, for it means that we are never permanently defined by any single moment or any single failure. The Stoic wisdom of the present moment teaches us that the only territory over which we have any true influence is the immediate unfolding of our current experience, and to dwell in the what if, or the if only, is to abandon the only ground upon which we can actually stand. This mental wandering is a form of self-imposed exile, a departure from the only reality that is ever available to us. We find that much of our suffering is not caused by life itself, but by our resistance to the way life is presenting itself. We create a second layer of pain through our judgment of the first. The first layer is the experience of loss, the sting of loneliness, or the tension of uncertainty, while the second layer is the internal outcry that says this should not be happening, that I should not be feeling this, that this is unfair. It is this second layer, the layer of resistance, that truly exhausts the soul. When we cease this resistance, we do not necessarily stop feeling the pain, but we stop the frantic, circular struggle against it, which is the part that truly drains our vitality. There is a quiet strength in allowing the unpleasant to exist without the need to immediately fix, change, or flee from it. It is the strength of the mountain that does not ask the storm to pass, but simply remains, letting the wind and the rain wash over its slopes, knowing that the storm is a transient phenomenon and the mountain is its silent container. This stillness is not a lack of feeling, but a spaciousness that allows feeling to move through us without getting stuck. We are like the sky, which provides the space for the clouds, the lightning, and the darkness to exist, yet the sky itself is never stained by the storm and never diminished by the shadow. In this spaciousness, we find that we are more than the sum of our anxieties and more than the collection of our achievements. We are the vast, underlying consciousness that allows all of this to be known. This realization does not make the world less significant or our responsibilities less important, but it changes the quality of our engagement with them. We begin to act from a place of clarity rather than a place of reactivity, moving through the world with a sense of purpose that is not tethered to the fear of failure or the hunger for praise. We learn to see the interconnectedness of all things, realizing that our own suffering is often a reflection of the suffering we inflict upon ourselves through our attachments and our rigid expectations. To live with an open heart in an uncertain world is the ultimate expression of courage. It is the willingness to be vulnerable, to be seen in our incompleteness, and to walk through the shifting landscapes of life with a steady and compassionate presence. This is the path of the observer, the one who sees the dance of the world and the dance of the mind, and recognizes that both are part of the same magnificent unfolding mystery. It is a heavy thing, this internal courtroom that remains perpetually in session, a private tribunal where the verdict is always preordained and the evidence is always weighted against the soul. In the stillness that follows the noise of the day, the mind often turns its gaze inward, not as a friend seeking to understand, but as a prosecutor seeking to condemn, replaying every stumble, every missed opportunity, and every perceived failure as if they were permanent stains upon the fabric of existence. This voice, so certain in its cruelty and so loud in its accusations, carries the weight of a profound misunderstanding. It speaks as if it were the ultimate arbiter of truth, yet it is merely a conditioned habit of the mind, a repetitive pattern of thought that has gained momentum through years of repetition, much like a river carving a canyon through stone. It is not a fixed truth, but a passing weather of the psyche, a storm of judgment that arises from a deep-seated fear of being inadequate, yet it presents itself as the very essence of who you are. There is a profound error in the belief that there is a solid, permanent, and inherently guilty self to be judged, for the wisdom of the ages suggests that what we call the eyes is actually a flowing stream of changing states, a continuous succession of arising and falling sensations, thoughts, and perceptions that never coalesce into a single, unchanging entity. When the mind attempts to cast a shadow of guilt upon a self that is itself a shifting landscape, it is attempting to pin a butterfly to a wall. The butterfly is not the pin, and the shadow is not the wing, and the judgment is not the being. To seek perfection is to chase a phantom, for the Stoic perspective reminds us that a person is the guardian of their own character, responsible only for the integrity of their intentions and the honesty of their efforts, not for the impossible standard of a flawlessness that no human being has ever possessed or could ever sustain. We are all part of a shared human nature, a vast and interconnected tapestry of striving and stumbling, and the error lies in the belief that we alone are the exceptions to the rule of imperfection. The war fought within the self is perhaps the most exhausting of all human conflicts, a relentless siege where the defender and the attacker are one and the same, leaving the spirit weary and the heart guarded against the very grace it seeks. There is a quietude that becomes possible only when the weapons are finally set down, when the long struggle to be something other than what is currently present is abandoned in favor of a radical acceptance of the present moment as it is. This acceptance does not mean a surrender to error or a dismissal of growth, but rather a recognition that one cannot truly heal, a wound that is being constantly reopened by the very hand that seeks to tend it. The same gentleness and compassion that would be offered a struggling friend, a person broken by circumstance or overwhelmed by their own limitations, is a debt owed to oneself, for we are the only witnesses to our own internal journey, and to meet our own suffering with hostility is to ensure that the suffering remains unmitigated. In the architecture of human consciousness, there is a subtle distinction between the thoughts that arise and the awareness that perceives them, a vast space of presence that exists beneath the turbulence of the mind's constant narration. The body is not merely a vessel for the intellect, nor a machine to be driven toward efficiency, but a living, breathing home for awareness, an anchor in the flux of existence that remains even when the thoughts become a chaotic storm. The very rhythm of life, the subtle rise and fall that accompanies every moment of being, serves as a constant, unspoken reminder of the continuity of existence, a natural cadence that exists independently of our judgments, our anxieties, or our attempts to control the uncontrollable. This presence is not something that must be manufactured or achieved through force, but is the fundamental ground of being that is always present, even when it is obscured by the thicket of a racing mind. When the mind becomes a theater of self-judgment, it loses its connection to this fundamental grounding, becoming untethered from the reality of the present and lost in the ghosts of the past or the shadows of a perceived future. The tension of the internal critic is a tension that pulls the awareness away from the immediate, lived reality and into a realm of abstraction, where the self is no longer a living presence, but a concept to be analyzed and corrected. There is a profound difference between the mind that observes a thought as a passing phenomenon and the mind that identifies with that thought as its own essence. The former finds a sense of spaciousness and ease, while the latter finds itself trapped in a cycle of constant reaction and defense. To recognize the thoughts as mere mental events, arising, persisting for a time, and then dissolving, is to reclaim a sense of agency that is not based on control, but on a quiet, steadfast observation of the truth of impermanence. The weight of self-judgment often stems from a desire for certainty in an inherently uncertain universe, a desperate attempt to use the intellect to solve the problem of being alive, which is a problem that cannot be solved, only lived. We struggle to find a foothold in the shifting sands of our own emotions, fearing that if we do not master our feelings, we will be swept away by them. Yet the very act of grasping at the shore only increases the sense of being adrift. There is a wisdom in allowing the waves to move as they will, recognizing that the ocean is much deeper and more stable than the surface agitation suggests, and that the storm is not the sea itself. This realization does not demand an immediate transformation of character, but offers a perspective from which a different kind of relationship with oneself might eventually emerge, one based on the understanding that we are part of a much larger, more complex, and more compassionate whole. The concept of the Watchers is not a role to be assumed or a technique to be practiced, but a description of a way of being that acknowledges the distinction between the stream of consciousness and the awareness that observes it. In this state of observation, the harshness of the inner critic loses its power, not because the critic has been silenced, but because its words are seen for what they are: sounds, images, and sensations passing through a vast, silent space. This space is not empty, but it is characterized by a lack of the frantic need to categorize or condemn, a stillness that remains even amidst the most intense mental activity. It is the realization that we are not the weather, nor are we the storm, but we are the sky that holds it all, the vast and enduring context in which all things arise and pass away. To dwell in this awareness is to move through the world with a different kind of gravity, one that is centered in the present and rooted in the reality of our shared human condition. The isolation that comes from the belief that we are uniquely flawed is a mirage created by the ego's desire for distinction, for in our very brokenness, we are most closely aligned with all other living beings. There is a profound dignity in the simple act of being, in the capacity to experience the world with an open and unjudging mind, even when that experience is colored by pain or confusion. This dignity is not something that can be earned through perfection or lost through failure. It is the inherent quality of a life lived in accordance with the truth of what is. As the mind's noise subsides, one might find that the internal landscape is not as hostile as it once seemed, but is instead a place of immense possibility and quiet beauty, provided one stops trying to pave over its natural contours. The imperfections that were once the basis for shame are revealed to be the very things that make the experience of being human so rich and so deeply interconnected with the experience of all others. There is a peace that comes not from the resolution of all problems, but from the cessation of the struggle to avoid the problems that are an inevitable part of the journey. This peace is not a static state of being, but a dynamic way of relating to the world, a willingness to meet each moment with a steady presence and a quiet, compassionate awareness of the unfolding mystery of existence. In the end, the task of a life is not to reach a state of perpetual calm or to achieve a state of sinless purity, but to cultivate a relationship with oneself that is marked by an enduring kindness and an unshakable acceptance of the flux of life. The wisdom of the ancients suggests that the greatest liberation is found not in the mastery of the world, but in the mastery of the way we perceive our own place within it, moving from a state of constant defense to a state of open, vulnerable, and compassionate presence. It is a movement from the narrow, suffocating confines of the ego's judgment into the expansive, breathing reality of the present moment, where the self is no longer a defendant in a courtroom, but a participant in a grand and unfolding dance. In this spaciousness, the heavy burdens of the past and the frantic anxieties of the future lose their grip, leaving only the immediate, living reality of being, a reality that is sufficient, complete, and profoundly enough exactly as it is. The weight of expectation, both the ones we place upon ourselves and the ones we imagine others have cast, acts as a subtle gravity that pulls the spirit away from the lightness of existence, creating a constant, low-level tension in the very core of our being. We spend a vast portion of our lives preparing for a version of ourselves that does not exist, polishing a concept of the self that is always just beyond our reach, a phantom version that is more capable, more serene, and more accomplished than the living, breathing human being who occupies this moment. This pursuit of an idealized self is a form of internal exile, a refusal to inhabit the messy, complicated, and beautifully imperfect reality of our current condition. And it is this very refusal that fuels the fires of dissatisfaction and the persistent ache of inadequacy. When the mind becomes obsessed with the distance between who we are and who we think we should be, it loses the ability to engage with the world as it actually presents itself, seeing instead only the gaps and the deficiencies that define our perceived shortcomings. There is a profound liberation in recognizing that the self is not a finished product to be perfected, but a continuous process of becoming, a river that is never the same from one moment to the next, constantly shifting and flowing through landscapes of joy and sorrow, stillness and movement. To accept this fluidity is to stop trying to build monuments out of water, to cease the frantic attempt to freeze the self into a static, unchangeable identity that can be defended and controlled. This acceptance does not mean a resignation to stagnation, but rather an openness to the inherent instability of all things, a recognition that the very nature of life is change, and that to resist this change is the primary source of our suffering. In the quiet spaces between our thoughts, there is a realization that the things we hold most dear, our reputations, our achievements, even our most cherished beliefs, are all subject to the same law of impermanence that governs the stars and the seasons, and that our attachment to them as permanent fixtures of our identity is a recipe for inevitable grief. Stoic wisdom suggests that much of our distress arises not from events themselves, but from the stories we tell ourselves about those events, the judgments we layer over reality until the actual truth is obscured by our own interpretations. When we strip away these layers of mental commentary, we are left with the raw, unadorned experience of being, which is often far more manageable and less threatening than the complex dramas our minds have constructed. This stripping away is not an act of denial, but an act of profound clarity, a willingness to see the world without the distorting lens of our own fears and desires. It is a movement toward a state of equanimity, where the fluctuations of external circumstances no longer have the power to uproot our internal stability, because that stability is no longer based on the shifting sands of fortune, but on the solid ground of presence. This presence is not a detachment from life, but a deeper engagement with it, a way of being that allows us to participate fully in the world without being consumed by its turbulence. It allows us to love without the desperate need for possession, to work without the crushing weight of ego-driven ambition, and to exist without the constant, exhausting need to prove our worth to a world that is itself equally lost in its own illusions. There is a quiet strength in this kind of being, a resilience that does not come from hardness or the suppression of feeling, but from a profound softness and a willingness to be vulnerable to the reality of life. As we move through the world with this awareness, we begin to see that the boundaries we have drawn between ourselves and others are often illusions of the ego, and that our shared vulnerability is the most profound point of connection we have with all of humanity. In this shared experience of being finite, limited, and constantly changing, there is a deep, underlying unity that transcends the individual stories we tell ourselves, offering a sense of belonging that is not contingent upon our performance or our perfection. To live in this way is to move with a sense of grace, not because we have mastered the art of living, but because we have stopped fighting the reality of what it means to be alive, finding a quiet, enduring peace in the midst of the beautiful, unfolding chaos of existence. The quiet that settles when the clamor of the world finally recedes often brings with it a different kind of noise. A private courtroom where the air is thick with the echoes of old mistakes and the persistent, sharp accusations of a voice that knows our every shadow. This voice, this relentless inner critic, arrives unbidden in the stillness, presenting a long, winding list of failures and shortcomings, acting as a judge that has never known the concept of mercy and a prosecutor who refuses to ever rest. It is a strange and heavy burden to carry, this sense of being perpetually on trial, where the verdict is always one of inadequacy, and the evidence is drawn from every stumble and every moment of weakness we have ever experienced. Yet, when viewed through the lens of a deeper understanding, this harshness reveals itself as nothing more than a conditioned habit of mind, a collection of mental patterns that have been rehearsed so many times they have mistaken their own momentum for the fundamental truth of our being. There is a profound misconception in the way we treat the thoughts that arise within us, as if every judgment we form about ourselves must be a factual report on the nature of our soul, when in reality, these thoughts are merely passing weather, storms of self-judgment that move through the sky of consciousness without ever becoming the sky itself. The sky remains, vast and unaffected, whether it is currently obscured by dark, heavy clouds or illuminated by a clear, bright sun. And so too is the essence of your awareness, an expansive space that contains the turbulence of the critic without being defined or destroyed by it. To witness these thoughts without being consumed by them is to realize that the voice which calls you unworthy is not a fixed entity, but a series of fleeting mental events, arising from old memories and current anxieties, swirling together for a moment before they inevitably dissolve back into the void. In the Buddhist understanding of the nature of reality, there is no solid, permanent, or unchanging self that stands in the dock to be condemned. There is only a continuous flow of changing states, a stream of perceptions, feelings, and thoughts that are in a constant state of arising and falling away. If there is no permanent singular core that remains identical from one moment to the next, then there is no permanent guilty person to be punished. Only the illusion of a fixed identity that the mind clings to in an attempt to find security in a world of flux. The person you were a decade ago is not the person who stands here now, and the person you were a moment ago has already vanished, leaving only the present moment, which is too fluid and too brief to be captured by the rigid labels of failure or shame. This realization offers a quiet liberation. For if the self is a process rather than a thing, then the judgments cast upon it are like shadows cast upon a river, momentarily dark and distorted, but ultimately unable to grasp or hold the water. There is a similar wisdom to be found in the Stoic recognition of our place within the vast, interconnected fabric of the cosmos, which teaches us that we are but small parts of a much larger, rational whole, and that much of what we suffer is due to our resistance to the natural order of things. We often hold ourselves to a standard of flawless perfection that no human being has ever achieved, forgetting that to be human is to be inherently limited, prone to error, and subject to the whims of fate and the limitations of our own biology. If we view ourselves as guardians of our character rather than monuments to perfection, we find a different kind of responsibility, one that is centered on the integrity of our current effort and the honesty of our intentions in this present moment, rather than an impossible demand for a life without mistakes. We are responsible for the direction of our will and the quality of our choices. But we are not responsible for the unpredictable outcomes of a world that we do not control, nor are we responsible for the inherent fallibility that is part of the very design of being a living, breathing creature. It is a peculiar form of cruelty to offer a hand of compassion to a friend who is struggling, to speak to them with patience and warmth when they have erred, yet to turn that same warmth inward and replace it with a cold, unrelenting bitterness when we ourselves stumble. There is no logical reason for this disparity, no moral justification for why the gentleness we so freely give to others is so often withheld from the very person who needs it most. Yet the ego finds a strange, perverse strength in the act of self-flagellation, as if by punishing ourselves we might somehow satisfy the demands of justice or prevent future failures. But this internal war is a war of attrition that can only end in exhaustion. For you cannot build a sanctuary of peace within a landscape of constant conflict, and the energy spent on the defense of an idealized self is energy stolen from the capacity to live fully and authentically in the present. When the long war against the self finally ceases, when the courtroom is emptied and the judge is allowed to step down from the bench, a profound silence begins to emerge. Not the silence of an absence, but the silence of a presence that has finally been allowed to settle. This quiet is the beginning of a true capacity for compassion, for it is only when we have made peace with our own fragmented and imperfect nature that we can truly see the shared human condition in others, recognizing that every person we encounter is also carrying their own secret courtroom and their own heavy, unstated burdens. We are all travelers on the same turbulent sea, navigating by the same flickering lights of hope and fear. And in this shared vulnerability, the walls of isolation begin to thin, revealing the profound interconnectedness that lies beneath the surface of our individual struggles. The heart, in its most honest and unadorned state, is a vast and complex territory, capable of immense darkness and exquisite light, and to accept this wholeness is to stop trying to prune away the shadows in a futile attempt to live in a world of perpetual noon. To embrace the shadow is not to dwell in it, but to acknowledge that it is a natural part of the landscape, a necessary contrast that gives depth and dimension to the light, and that the attempts to deny our darker impulses only serve to give them more power and more weight. A person who has accepted their own capacity for error, their own capacity for selfishness and fear, is a person who can move through the world with a much deeper, more grounded kind of kindness. A kindness that is not a fragile thing dependent on being good, but a resilient thing born from the recognition of our shared imperfection. There is a certain majesty in the realization that we are part of a cosmic unfolding that is far larger than our individual dramas, a vastness that holds all things, the stars, the oceans, the mountains, and the most fleeting of human thoughts, within its infinite embrace. In the scale of the universe, the anxieties that keep us awake at night and the self-judgments that weigh upon our hearts are infinitesimally small, not because they do not matter, but because they are part of a much larger, beautiful, and chaotic movement that is constantly renewing itself. To align oneself with this vastness is to find a sense of belonging that is not based on achievement or social standing, but on the simple, profound fact of our existence, a sense of being held by the very nature of reality itself. As the thoughts continue to rise and fall like waves upon a shore, one might observe how they are all part of the same movement, a rhythmic pulse of existence that is neither good nor bad, but simply is. There is no need to catch the waves or to hold them still. There is only the capacity to witness the tide, to understand that the ebb and flow is the very nature of the ocean, and to remain steady upon the shore, unmoved by the constant shifting of the surface. This steadiness is not a hardness of heart, but a profound softness, a willingness to be moved by beauty and by sorrow alike without being swept away by either. A quiet strength that comes from knowing that nothing is ever truly lost and nothing is ever permanent. In the end, perhaps the greatest wisdom lies in the simple act of being present with the reality of what is, without the constant urge to edit, correct, or judge the unfolding moment. When we stop trying to be something other than what we are in this very second, we find that we are already enough, not because we have reached some state of perfection, but because we have finally stopped pretending that perfection was ever a requirement for our participation in the dance of life. This acceptance is not a surrender to defeat, but a surrender to truth, a recognition that the most profound way to inhabit this world is to move through it with an open heart, accepting the light and the shadow as two sides of the same magnificent and ever-changing whole. The weight of the world often feels like a series of heavy stones we have chosen to carry, as if by accumulating the burdens of the past or the anxieties of the future, we might somehow earn our place in the present. We treat our memories like archives of grievances, and our expectations like blueprints for a life that hasn't happened, forgetting that the only reality we ever truly inhabit is the one unfolding right now, in the space between one breath and the next. This constant reaching for something else, some improved version of ourselves or some distant state of certainty, creates a fundamental rift in our experience, a sense of being perpetually elsewhere, always on the threshold of a life that has not yet arrived. If we could only recognize that the threshold is all there is, the frantic need to cross it might begin to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding that the journey and the destination are not two separate things, but a single, continuous movement of being. It is in this movement that we find the true meaning of equanimity, which is not the absence of feeling, but the ability to remain centered amidst the storm, like the deep, still waters of the ocean that remain undisturbed by the crashing of the waves upon the surface. We often mistake stillness for stagnation, fearing that if we stop the internal struggle to control our emotions, we will be swept away by them. But the opposite is true. It is the struggle itself, the tight grip we maintain on our preferences and our aversions, that creates the turbulence. When we stop trying to force the river to flow in a particular direction, we discover that the water has its own wisdom, its own way of navigating the obstacles in its path, and that there is a grace in following the natural course of things that cannot be achieved through sheer willpower. This grace is found in the recognition of impermanence, the fundamental truth that all things, our joys, our sorrows, our very identities, are in a constant state of flux, rising and falling in a rhythmic dance of emergence and dissolution. To grasp at anything in a world of constant change is to invite suffering, for the act of grasping is an attempt to freeze a river in mid-flow, a defiance of the very nature of reality that leads only to exhaustion and disappointment. When we finally allow the things we love to pass and the things we fear to dissolve, we find that we are not emptied, but rather we are opened, creating a vastness within ourselves that can hold the entire spectrum of human experience without being shattered by any single part of it. This openness is the foundation of a genuine peace. A peace that does not depend on the absence of trouble, but on the presence of a steady, unwavering awareness that remains whole, regardless of the circumstances. We are often our own most relentless critics, holding ourselves to a standard of logic and composure that we would never demand of another, as if we were separate from the messy, irrational, and beautiful chaos of the human condition. But we are not observers of the human condition. We are the very fabric of it, woven from the same threads of uncertainty and longing that characterize every other living being. To judge ourselves is to judge the very nature of life. And in doing so, we create a sense of isolation that no amount of achievement or self-improvement can ever truly bridge. The path to wholeness does not lie in the perfection of the self, but in the integration of the self, the willingness to bring the light of our awareness into the darkest corners of our being and to say to our shame, our fear, and our loneliness, "You are also part of me, and you are welcome here." This radical acceptance is the ultimate act of courage, for it requires us to face the reality of our own vulnerability without the armor of ego or the distractions of busyness. It is a quiet, steady courage that does not seek to conquer the world, but to inhabit it with a profound sense of presence and a heart that remains soft even when it has been bruised. In this state of presence, the distinction between the observer and the observed begins to blur, and we find that we are not merely watching the world, but are an integral part of its unfolding, a single note in a vast and complex symphony that is being played out in this very moment, and in every moment that has ever been or will ever be. There is a profound dignity in simply existing, in being a conscious part of this immense and unfolding mystery, and in finding the capacity to witness the beauty and the tragedy of it all with a heart that is both deeply moved and fundamentally at rest. The weight of that internal courtroom where the gavel falls without respite and the verdict is always one of insufficiency is perhaps the most exhausting labor a human spirit can endure. It is a private litigation, a relentless rehearsal of every misstep and every missed opportunity, where the prosecutor and the judge and the executioner are all the same, singular, unrelenting voice. This voice arrives most clearly when the external noise of the world retreats, leaving a silence that is not a sanctuary, but a stage for the recitation of old failures. It speaks in the language of permanence, claiming that a mistake is not a singular event, but a fundamental stain upon the essence of who you are, as if the character were a stone carved in granite rather than a river, constantly flowing and changing its course. Yet, there is a profound truth to be found in the realization that this critic is not a source of objective truth, but merely a conditioned habit of mind, a storm of mental weather that arises from the friction of desire and the fear of inadequacy. It is a pattern of thought that has been practiced so often that it has acquired the illusion of solidity, a repetitive loop of judgment that feels as real as the ground beneath one's feet, but which is, in its essence, as transient as a passing cloud or a sudden wind. To look closely at this voice is to see it for what it is: a collection of perceptions, a flurry of judgments, a series of mental movements that arise from past conditioning and the natural human tendency to seek safety through self-correction. In the deep wisdom of the Buddha, we find the insight that there is no permanent, unchanging, and singular self that can be held responsible for these judgments, or even a solid, guilty core that deserves their condemnation. There is only a continuous stream of arising and passing phenomena, a dance of thoughts, feelings, and sensations that are in a constant state of flux. When the mind attempts to grasp a self, to punish, it is attempting to hold on to a phantom, a concept that has no more substance than the mist on a mountain at dawn. The one who is accused is a moving target, a collection of changing states that are never the same from one moment to the next, making the attempt to find a permanent criminal an exercise in chasing shadows. To judge the self is to try to freeze a river in place, to demand that the water stop moving so that it might be examined for its impurities. But the water is never still, and the purity of the river is not found in its stillness, but in its capacity to flow, to adapt, and to eventually wash away the sediment of the past. There is a parallel grace to be found in the understanding that the only domain truly within our control is the integrity of our own intention and the quiet stewardship of our character. The world demands a standard of perfection that is not only impossible, but is entirely contrary to the nature of a being in flux. To hold oneself to the ideal of a flawless existence is to wage a war against the very nature of being human. The Stoic perspective suggests that we are the guardians of our own internal landscape, tasked with the honest effort of living with reason and virtue. But we are not responsible for the outcomes that the universe weaves into its vast and complex tapestry. A person is not a finished product to be judged by a static metric, but a continuous process of becoming, an ongoing dialogue between our will and the unfolding of reality. When we stumble, we are not failing a test of our essence. We are simply participating in the shared, stumbling nature of all sentient life. Every person who has ever lived has walked this path of error and intention, stumbling through the dark with the same limited vision and the same fragile strength. In this light, the harshness we direct inward is a profound misunderstanding of the nature of our shared existence. We possess an innate capacity for tenderness toward the suffering of others, an ability to see a friend in distress and offer a quiet, non-judgmental presence that recognizes their struggle as part of the human condition. There is a strange, persistent blindness that prevents us from extending that same gentleness to the person we see in the mirror. We act as though we are an exception to the rule of compassion, as if we are the only beings in the universe who deserve the coldness of our own scrutiny. But the suffering of the self is no less real than the suffering of the stranger, and the cruelty we inflict upon our own minds is a profound dissonance with the wisdom we claim to hold for the world. To practice compassion toward oneself is not an act of indulgence or a surrender to weakness. It is a recognition of the fundamental truth that we are part of the same suffering, beautiful, and interconnected life that we seek to love in others. When the long war against the self finally ceases, a different kind of quiet begins to emerge, a stillness that does not require the absence of thought, but rather a change in our relationship to it. This is the quiet that comes from setting down the heavy weapons of self-judgment and the exhausting burden of trying to hold on to a version of ourselves that is already gone. It is the quiet of the observer who has realized that they are not the storm, but the space in which the storm occurs. There is a tremendous release in the realization that we do not need to master the mind, but merely to witness its movements with a sense of detached curiosity. The thoughts that arise, the accusations, the regrets, the anxieties about what is to come, they are merely guests passing through a vast and open hall. They may be loud, they may be frightening, they may be persistent, but they do not own the hall, and they cannot change the nature of the space they inhabit. There is a certain wisdom in the art of non-attachment, in the understanding that much of our internal agony stems from our desperate attempt to grip what is inherently ungraspable. We try to hold on to moments of happiness as if they were permanent possessions, and we try to push away moments of pain as if they were permanent enemies. This gripping is the root of our restlessness, for it is an attempt to impose a static order upon a dynamic and flowing reality. When we stop trying to control the uncontrollable, when we stop demanding that the present moment be anything other than exactly what it is, we find that we have been carrying a weight that was never ours to bear. The past is a memory of a movement that has already ceased, and the future is a projection of a movement that has not yet begun. Only the present is real, and in the present there is nothing to be fought, only that which is. This shift in perspective does not mean the absence of difficulty or the end of the struggle with the complexities of life. It means a change in the quality of the struggle. It is the difference between a person fighting against the current of a river and a person who has learned to float, moving with the water, even when the currents are strong and the waters are dark. To float is not to be passive or indifferent, but to move with a profound sense of acceptance, recognizing that the movement of the river is not an obstacle to be overcome, but the very nature of the journey. In this state of flowing, the self is no longer a fortress to be defended or a courtroom to be managed, but a vessel that is open to the vastness of experience. The judgments that once felt like absolute truths begin to lose their grip, revealing themselves as nothing more than the echoes of old fears and the shadows cast by our own expectations. The peace that arrives in this realization is not a peace of silence, but a peace of wholeness. It is the peace that comes from integrating the shadow and the light, the failure and the effort, the brokenness and the capacity for repair. it is the recognition that we are both the one who stumbles and the one who can witness the stumble with a compassionate eye. We are not merely our mistakes, nor are we merely our successes. We are the vast, unfolding awareness that contains both. As we move through the world, we carry this quietude within us, a center of stillness that remains even when the external world is in chaos. We find that we no longer need to seek validation from the echoes of our own thoughts. For the validation we require is found in the simple, profound act of being present with our own existence, without the need for condemnation or the demand for perfection. In this spaciousness, the heavy armor of the ego begins to fall away, leaving something much more essential and much more resilient, a heart that is open to the mystery of being, and a mind that is at home in the flow of the eternal now. The landscape of the mind is often like a vast, turbulent ocean, where the surface is whipped into whitecaps by winds of worry, and the tides of memory pull us relentlessly toward shores of regret. It is easy to become lost in the salt and the spray, to believe that we are the waves themselves, defined only by our height, our fury, or our eventual dissolution into the foam. Yet, if one could descend beneath the surface, far below the agitation of the currents and the chaos of the storm, there is a depth that remains undisturbed, a profound and heavy stillness that persists regardless of the weather above. This depth is our true nature, the part of our being that is not subject to the whims of emotion or the frantic demands of the ego. To find this depth is not to escape the ocean, but to recognize that the storm is only a movement upon the surface, a temporary disturbance in a much larger and more stable reality. This realization does not diminish the reality of the storm, for the waves are real and the winds are felt, but it changes the way we relate to the turbulence. We no longer need to be tossed about by every crest and trough, for we have found an anchor in the realization that the essence of our being is not found in the motion, but in the space that allows the motion to occur. There is a certain dignity in this quiet observation, a way of being in the world that acknowledges the presence of suffering without being consumed by it. This is the essence of the middle way, the path that avoids the extremes of frantic attachment and hollow indifference. It is a way of walking through the world with an open heart, allowing the experiences of joy and sorrow to pass through us like light through clear glass, coloring the moment without staining the lens. When we stop trying to curate our internal experience, when we stop demanding that our thoughts be a certain way or that our emotions be of a certain quality, we find that the resistance which creates so much of our suffering begins to dissipate. Much of our mental exhaustion comes from the sheer energy required to maintain the illusions we have built around ourselves, the masks of competence, the defenses of pride, and the heavy veils of self-protection. We spend much of our lives building fortresses to guard a self that is essentially a fluid and changing process, trying to protect a boundary that is actually porous and interconnected with everything else. In the end, the effort to keep the world at a distance is what makes us feel so profoundly alone. The boundary we work so hard to maintain is the very thing that separates us from the flow of life, making us feel like an island in a vast sea rather than a part of the sea itself. To soften that boundary, to allow ourselves to be moved by the beauty and the tragedy of existence, is not a sign of vulnerability, but a sign of profound strength. It is the strength of the willow that bends in the gale, while the rigid oak is uprooted. There is a deep, quiet wisdom in knowing that we are not separate from the universe, that the atoms of our bodies and the currents of our thoughts are part of the same cosmic dance that moves the stars and governs the turning of the seasons. When we align ourselves with this truth, the sense of isolation that fuels our anxiety begins to lose its power. We are not small, lost creatures struggling against an indifferent void. We are the universe, experiencing itself through a specific and temporary lens. This perspective does not make our individual lives feel insignificant. Rather, it makes every moment of consciousness feel sacred, for we are the witnesses through which the infinite contemplates its own splendor. This witnessing requires no effort, no striving, and no special attainment. It is simply the natural state of being that remains when the noise of the striving has subsided. It is the recognition that we are already home, even when we feel lost, even when we feel broken, and even when we feel entirely alone. The wholeness of being is not a goal to be reached or a state to be achieved through willpower, but a reality to be recognized through the cessation of the search. When the search ends, the seeker is found, standing in the center of a life that is unfolding with perfect and unhurried grace, held by a presence that is as ancient as time itself and as fresh as the rising sun. The mind often becomes a private courtroom where the trial never ends, a place where the prosecutor is a voice born of old wounds and the judge is a phantom of our own making. In the stillness of the evening, when the external world ceases its clamor, this internal witness often turns its gaze inward with a terrifying, unrelenting sharpness, cataloging every stumble, every missed opportunity, and every shadow of a thought that failed to meet the impossible standards of an idealized self. It is a voice that speaks in the language of permanent failure, a voice that insists that our mistakes are not things we have done, but things we are. It transforms a moment of weakness into a fundamental flaw in our very essence. Yet, when one looks closely at the nature of this judgment, it reveals itself to be nothing more than a conditioned habit of thought, a repetitive weather pattern of the psyche that arises from the friction of wanting things to be other than they are. It is a storm that passes through the sky of awareness, loud and frightening in its turbulence, but the sky itself remains untouched by the lightning or the rain. There is a profound illusion in the belief that there is a solid, permanent, and guilty self standing in the dock to be condemned. To search for the I that has failed is to hunt for a ghost in a hall of mirrors. For as soon as the mind attempts to pin down the culprit, it finds only a shifting mosaic of perceptions, memories, and sensations that are in a constant state of flux. The Buddha taught that the concept of a fixed, unchanging self is the root of much suffering, and this truth offers a quiet sanctuary for the weary heart. If there is no permanent, solid self, then there is no permanent, solid failure. There are only changing states of being, rising and falling like the tides, and the person who was ashamed a moment ago is not the same person who is experiencing that shame now. The shame is a passing phenomenon, a cloud passing over a mountain, but the mountain remains, vast and unmoving, beneath the shifting weather of the mind. The Stoic perspective invites us to see our character not as a finished monument to be judged, but as a continuous stewardship of our own will. We are the guardians of our intentions, responsible for the integrity of our efforts in this present, unfolding moment, yet we are never responsible for the achievement of a flawless perfection that belongs to the realm of gods not humans. To demand perfection from oneself is to demand that the river flow upward or that the wind cease its wandering. It is a rejection of the very nature of the cosmos. We stumble because to stumble is the shared inheritance of all who breathe, a fundamental part of the human condition that binds us to one another in a vast, invisible web of common struggle. There is a peculiar kind of loneliness in the belief that we alone are uniquely broken, a loneliness that dissolves when we recognize that the struggle to be good, to be kind, and to be whole is the singular, beautiful labor of every living soul. We often reserve a boundless, luminous gentleness for the friend who is suffering, offering them grace for their errors and patience for their confusion. Yet we deny that same mercy to the person staring back at us in the mirror. This discrepancy is a strange and heavy burden, a refusal to extend the natural compassion of the heart to the very source of that heart's existence. It is a misunderstanding of what it means to be a part of the whole. For if we are truly connected to all things, then to be cruel to ourselves is to be cruel to the life that flows through the entire universe. The war against the self is a war fought with broken weapons, a conflict that can never be won because the one fighting and the one being fought are made of the same starlight and the same dust. When this long, exhausting war finally ceases, it is not because the faults have vanished, but because the need to punish them has been seen as a hollow and futile pursuit. Beneath the restless surface of the mind, where the thoughts churn like silt in a disturbed stream, there exists a depth of stillness that is not merely the absence of noise, but a presence of profound clarity. This stillness is not something that is created through effort. It cannot be summoned by the will or manufactured by the quieting of the senses. It is the foundational reality that has always been present, the quiet ocean that remains undisturbed even as the waves crash and foam upon the surface. We spend so much of our lives trying to calm the waves, trying to smooth the surface so that we might finally find peace. Yet the peace we seek is not in the smoothness of the water, but in the depth of the ocean itself. The waves are the thoughts, the emotions, and the frantic movements of the ego. But the stillness is the very medium in which they arise and to which they eventually return. This depth is not a void, nor is it a place of emptiness. It is a fullness that contains all things without being defined by them. It is the silence that allows music to be heard, the space that allows movement to occur, and the stillness that allows the dancing of the world to be perceived. To move toward this stillness is not to escape the world or to retreat from life, but to find the center of gravity that allows one to move through the world with a different kind of grace. When we find that center, the chaos of the surface no longer feels like a threat to our core. We can watch the storms arise and subside, knowing that the depths remain unshakable, held in an eternal and effortless equilibrium. In this profound quiet, the distinction between the observer and the observed begins to soften, and the rigid boundaries of the ego, those sharp, defensive lines we draw to protect our pride and our perceived failures, begin to lose their grip. We realize that we are not the thoughts that pass through us, nor are we the emotions that swell and recede like the tide. We are the vast, luminous awareness in which all these things occur. This realization brings no sudden flash of lightning or dramatic transformation. Rather, it is a quiet, steady recognition, a settling into the truth of what is. It is the recognition that the turbulence of life is not an interruption of the peace, but the very movement of the peace itself, expressing its infinite variety through the medium of time and change. The weight of the world often feels unbearable because we try to carry it as if it were a solid object, a collection of problems to be solved and burdens to be endured. But the world is a flow, a continuous unfolding of cause and effect, and we are part of that flow, not separate from it. When we stop trying to grasp the passing water and instead allow ourselves to be carried by the current, the tension of the struggle begins to dissolve. This is not a surrender to defeat, but a surrender to reality, a recognition that there is a wisdom in the unfolding that is greater than our individual intellects, and a rhythm to existence that operates far beyond our ability to control. To live in this awareness is to walk through the world with a lightness of being, even when the circumstances are heavy. It is to be able to hold the sorrow of the world without being consumed by it, and to hold the joy of the moment without the desperate need to possess it. We learn to inhabit the present moment, not as a fleeting point on a timeline, but as an eternal presence, the only place where life truly occurs. In the present, there is no past to regret and no future to fear. There is only the immediate, shimmering reality of what is, and the capacity to witness it with a heart that is both wide and still. The shadows of our past, the ghosts of who we thought we should have been, and the anxieties of who we fear we might become, all lose their power when they are brought into the light of this steady, non-judgmental presence. They are seen for what they are, stories told by a mind trying to find safety in a world of constant change. When we stop feeding these stories with our attention and our judgment, they lose their momentum and fade into the background, leaving behind the clarity of the present. We find that we have been searching for a destination, when we were actually the very ground upon which the journey was being walked. There is a great mercy in the realization that we do not need to be anything other than what we are in this very moment. The striving for a better version of ourselves, while often born of a desire for growth, can become a subtle form of self-rejection if it is rooted in the belief that our current state is fundamentally inadequate. True growth is not an escape from the self, but a deepening into the self, an unfolding of the qualities of compassion, patience, and wisdom that are already latent within our being. It is a process of uncovering, not of constructing, of stripping away the layers of conditioning and defense until the original, luminous nature of our awareness is revealed. As the mind settles, the very nature of our relationship to suffering changes. We no longer see pain as an enemy to be avoided at all costs, but as a teacher that points us toward the impermanence of all things and the necessity of compassion. Suffering is the friction of the ego against the reality of life, and in that friction, there is an opportunity for profound insight. When we stop resisting the pain and instead offer it our presence, it transforms. It becomes a bridge to the shared experience of all sentient beings, a way to feel the heartbeat of the world in its most vulnerable and honest form. In the end, the quiet that becomes possible is not the quiet of a graveyard, but the quiet of a living, breathing presence. It is a silence that is pregnant with meaning, a stillness that is vibrant with the movement of life. It is the peace that comes from knowing that we are never truly lost, for we are the very space in which all things arise and fall. We are the witness, the container, and the life itself, held in the unhurried, eternal embrace of the whole. The mind possesses a strange and heavy capacity for its own indictment, a private courtroom that remains perpetually in session even when the world outside has fallen into silence. There is a voice that arises, sharp and unyielding, which seems to hold a ledger of every mistake, every missed opportunity, and every perceived flaw in the architecture of the soul. This internal prosecutor does not argue for justice, but for a kind of endless, exhausting perfection that no living creature could ever sustain. It treats the fleeting errors of a human life as if they were permanent stains upon a permanent character, ignoring the fundamental truth that the self is not a solid, unchanging monument, but a shifting confluence of rivers, winds, and light. The voice that judges is itself a phenomenon, a collection of conditioned habits and echoes of old criticisms, a storm that rolls in from the horizon of memory, yet it is mistaken for the sky itself. To observe this voice is to realize that it is merely a weather pattern of the psyche, a passing cloud of thought that carries its own dark weight but possesses no substance of its own. When the accusations begin to mount, when the mind starts to replay the grievances of the past with the relentless rhythm of a drum, there is the possibility of seeing these thoughts as nothing more than sound and sensation. They are movements in a vast internal landscape, arising from the soil of habit and dissolving back into the void without ever having truly touched the core of what is. There is no permanent, guilty self at the center of the storm, only a continuous stream of changing states, a succession of arising and falling perceptions that never coalesce into a single, unchangeable entity. To seek a permanent version of oneself, to condemn, is to chase a shadow in the moonlight. The shadow moves as the light moves, and the one who seeks to punish it is chasing a phantom. The weight of this self-judgment often stems from a profound misunderstanding of the nature of being, a belief that we must be flawless to be worthy of our own kindness. We often hold ourselves to a standard of purity and competence that we would never demand of another, denying ourselves the same grace we would so freely offer a friend who is struggling, tired, or broken. If a traveler were to stumble on a difficult path, the compassionate heart would offer a hand or a moment of rest. Yet, when the stumble occurs within the landscape of our own experience, we often respond with a whip of contempt. There is a deep, quiet wisdom in recognizing that the same gentleness required to nurture a stranger is the very medicine required to sustain the self. This is not a dismissal of responsibility, but a recognition of our shared human fragility, the understanding that to be alive is to be inherently imperfect, to be a creature of impulse, error, and constant learning. There is a dignity in the Stoic realization that we are the guardians of our own character, tasked only with the integrity of our current intention and the honesty of our effort. We are not responsible for the perfection of the outcome, nor are we the masters of the chaotic forces that act upon us from the outside. We are only responsible for the quality of our will in this singular, unrepeatable moment. The universe does not demand that we be gods, but that we be humans, navigating the currents of fate with a steady and upright spirit. To strive for perfection is to wage a war against the nature of reality itself, for reality is a place of constant flux, of decay and growth, of beginnings and endings. When the battle against the self is finally set aside, it is not because the flaws have vanished, but because the need to fight them has been understood as a futile exhaustion of the spirit. This cessation of the internal war creates a space that is not empty, but filled with a profound and quiet presence. In the absence of the critic, there is a vastness that allows for the simple fact of existence to be enough. The heavy burden of being a somebody who must constantly prove their worth begins to dissolve, leaving only the experience of being, a witness to the unfolding of life as it is, without the distorting lens of judgment. The shadows that once seemed so menacing, the parts of the self we tried so hard to hide or rectify, are seen now as part of the whole, necessary textures in the complex tapestry of a lived life. There is a wholeness in accepting the darkness along with the light, a realization that the shadow is not an enemy of the light, but a consequence of it. As the light fades and the movements of the world slow their frantic pace, there is a natural inclination toward a stillness that mirrors the turning of the earth. The day carries its own rhythm of effort and release, a cycle of rising and setting that requires no justification and seeks no validation. The accomplishments of the morning and the regrets of the afternoon are both part of the same passing tide, washing over the shore of consciousness and retreating into the vast ocean of what has been. There is a profound peace in the recognition that the day is complete in itself, regardless of whether it was a day of triumph or a day of struggle. The sun does not apologize for setting, nor does the moon seek permission to rise. They simply follow the ancient, unhurried laws of the cosmos. The stillness that arrives at the end of a cycle is a gentle return to the source, a surrender to the quietude that has always been present beneath the noise of thought. It is a surrender not of defeat, but of trust, a letting go of the need to control the unfolding of the night or the arrival of the dawn. The mind, no longer occupied with the defense of the ego or the prosecution of the past, finds itself drifting in a sea of quietude, where the boundaries between the self and the world begin to soften and blur. In this space, there is no need for words, no need for explanation, no need for the constant, striving energy that defines much of our waking life. There is only the quiet observation of the moment, a soft awareness that rests within the vast, unconditioned space of being, as the world settles into the profound and wordless peace of an ending day. The silence that follows a long period of mental noise is not merely the absence of sound, but a presence in its own right, a rich and textured stillness that possesses its own weight and substance. It is as if the air itself becomes more substantial, more meaningful, as the frantic oscillations of the mind begin to find their natural equilibrium. When the constant stream of commentary, the endless why, and the relentless what if finally begins to ebb, there is a sensation of returning to a home we had forgotten we inhabited. This home is not a physical place, but a state of being that remains constant beneath the turbulence of emotion and the debris of thought. We spend so much of our lives building fortresses of identity, constructing elaborate structures of belief, memory, and expectation to protect ourselves from the perceived void. Yet it is often in the dissolution of these structures that the truest sense of self is found. The self that we defend so fiercely is often just a collection of stories we have told ourselves about who we should be. A character written by the hands of our upbringing, our traumas, and our social anxieties. When these stories lose their grip, when the character is no longer required to perform or to defend its territory, there is a profound sense of relief that transcends mere physical rest. It is the relief of no longer having to maintain the illusion of a separate, isolated, and inherently flawed entity standing in opposition to the rest of the world. The boundary between the observer and the observed begins to thin, revealing that the observer is not a solid thing, but a continuous process of witnessing, a mirror that reflects the world without being changed by the images it holds. This mirror-like quality of the mind is its most sacred attribute, for it allows for a clarity that is untainted by the colors of desire or the shadows of aversion. When the mind is no longer busy trying to change what it perceives, it becomes a clear vessel for the reality of the present moment. There is a vast, unhurried dignity in this way of being, a way that respects the unfolding of life as a series of natural, interconnected events rather than a series of problems to be solved or obstacles to be overcome. The weight of the world, which can often feel like a crushing pressure upon the chest, begins to feel less like a burden and more like the natural gravity of existence, a force that anchors us to the earth and reminds us of our belonging to the whole. We often mistake our resistance to life's inherent difficulty for a sign of strength, believing that to struggle against the current is the only way to maintain our integrity. Yet there is a deeper strength found in the capacity to move with the current, to navigate the complexities of existence with a fluid and yielding grace. This yielding is not a form of passivity, but an active form of acceptance, a recognition that the most effective way to interact with the world is through alignment rather than friction. The Stoic sage understood that much of our suffering arises not from the events themselves, but from our judgments about those events, the way we label certain occurrences as bad or unfortunate, and in doing so, create a secondary layer of suffering that is entirely of our own making. When we strip away these judgments, when we see things as they are, as movements of nature, as shifts in the pattern of cause and effect, we find that the core of our being remains untouched by the chaos of the external world. We are like the deep ocean, which remains calm and silent in its depths, even as the surface is churned into white foam by the wind and the waves. The storms are real. They are powerful, and they are inevitable, but they are surface phenomena that do not reach the profound stillness of the deep. This depth is accessible to everyone, at any time, if only the surface is allowed to settle. The darkness that comes with the end of the day is not an absence of light, but a different kind of light, a quietude that allows the nuances of the world to be felt rather than seen. It is a time when the sharp edges of the day are softened, when the distinctions between self and other, between thought and experience, begin to lose their urgency. There is a profound wisdom in the way the natural world prepares for rest, in the way the trees do not struggle to grow in the dark, and the way the animals settle into the rhythm of the night. There is a profound intelligence in the way the universe simply permits things to be, without the need for constant intervention or the demand for immediate results. We are part of the same cosmic intelligence, a part of a grand unfolding dance that requires no direction and seeks no audience. To align ourselves with this rhythm is to find a sense of peace that is not dependent on the circumstances of our lives, but is rooted in the fundamental nature of our existence. It is a peace that is found in the realization that we are already home, that we have never been anything other than a part of the infinite, ever-changing movement of life. The anxiety that characterizes much of the modern experience is often a form of temporal displacement, a mind that is perpetually living in a future that has not yet arrived, or a past that has already vanished. To live in the present is to reclaim our life from the thieves of regret and anticipation, to stand firmly on the ground of what is actually occurring right here, right now. In this presence, there is an inherent wholeness that cannot be diminished by loss or complicated by gain. We are not a sum of our achievements, nor are we a collection of our failures. We are the awareness in which all these things arise and pass away. This awareness is the only constant, the only truly permanent thing we can ever know, and it is characterized by a quiet, luminous stability. As the night deepens, the need for thought begins to fade, replaced by a sense of pure, unadorned being. The thoughts that do arise are like ripples on a pond, briefly disturbing the surface before the water returns to its stillness. The mind becomes a vast, dark sky, and the thoughts are merely stars or passing clouds, luminous and brief, but ultimately insignificant in the face of the infinite expanse. There is a profound comfort in this insignificance, a release from the exhausting duty of being the center of the universe. We are not the masters of the cosmos, but we are its witnesses, and in that witnessing, we find our most authentic purpose. The day has done its work, the light has played its part, and now the time has come for the great silent turning of the world. There is nothing left to achieve, nothing left to prove, and nothing left to hold on to. There is only the quiet, unfolding presence of the night and the gentle, unhurried descent into the stillness that has been waiting for us since the very beginning.